The talent show had already dragged on for nearly 2 hours, and the air inside the auditorium had grown heavy with impatience. A row of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above the stage, casting everything in a sterile, unforgiving glow. The wooden chairs creaked as restless spectators shifted, waiting for the next act to either impress or humiliate itself. Most acts had leaned toward the latter. A boy who tried to juggle glass bottles had nearly cut his hand. A group of dancers moved stiffly, out of sync, their glittering costumes doing little to distract from their mistakes. Even the judges, 3 figures seated at a long table near the stage, had grown weary. Their pens scratched lazily against clipboards, their yawns poorly concealed. They were eager for the evening to end. And then they called her name. "Next up, Amara Johnson," announced the host, his voice booming with forced cheer. A ripple of amusement passed through the crowd. The name belonged to a girl who had spent most of the night sitting quietly backstage, clutching her number card like it was a lifeline. She was not the type of contestant the crowd was waiting for. Amara stepped into the light. She was 16, slight of frame, and wore a simple blouse tucked into a long skirt. No sequins, no bold makeup, no signs of performance flair. Her braids were neatly tied back, and she looked more like a girl ready for Sunday's service than for a stage built to impress. The contrast was striking, and for many in the room, amusing. A laugh rang out from somewhere in the middle rows. A murmur followed, like the ripple of a stone hitting water. She heard it all. She always did. Her shoes scuffed against the stage floor as she made her way toward the microphone. The spotlight felt hotter than she expected, its beam like a weight pressing down on her. She gripped the microphone stand, her knuckles white against the black metal. At the judges' table, one of them, a man with a sharp suit and sharper smirk, leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised. "Well, this should be interesting," he muttered just loud enough for his colleagues to hear. The woman beside him hid her laugh behind a hand. The third judge scribbled something without even looking up. Amara swallowed hard. She knew this script all too well. The plain girl, the quiet one, the one no one expected to shine. People rarely saw her beyond the surface. They saw her size, her skin, her silence, and decided for her what she was worth. At school, she was the one teachers forgot to call on, the one classmates mocked in whispers, the one told she was sweet, but not much of anything. And now, here she was, standing before hundreds of eyes waiting for her to prove them right. The host hovered at the edge of the stage, smiling too wide, his tone dripping with condescension. "Don't be shy now, sweetheart. The stage is all yours." A few chuckles followed. Amara lowered her eyes for a moment, her lashes brushing her cheeks. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. The microphone felt slippery under her trembling hands. The laughter burned, crawling under her skin. For a brief, dangerous second, she thought about walking off stage. She imagined the relief of escape, the safety of silence. But then, from somewhere deep in memory, came her grandmother's voice. "They'll try to shrink you, baby. Don't let them. When your time comes, fill the room." Her grandmother's voice was the anchor she had always needed. That voice had sung lullabies over her crib, hummed hymns while stirring pots on the stove, whispered prayers into her hair window. World felt too heavy. It had been gone for 2 years now, taken by illness, but in moments like this, Amara could almost hear it again, steady and warm. She lifted her chin. The crowd was still restless, some smiling, some shaking their heads in anticipation of failure. The judges leaned back, poised to watch the train wreck unfold. The host's smirk widened. And yet, inside her, something shifted. The fear did not vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer a weight dragging her down but a spark igniting in her chest. Her body still trembled, but her spirit straightened its spine. She realized something important in that instant: the mockery in the room wasn't a verdict. It was a challenge. Her lips parted slightly as she drew in a deep breath. She didn't speak yet. She let the silence stretch, though it burned. She could feel the impatience buzzing in the room, but she used it, let it feed the fire inside her. Her eyes swept over the crowd once, just once, and she saw them not as an enemy but as witnesses. Witnesses who would soon learn the truth. Behind her ribs, her heart pounded. But behind her voice, something greater waited, pressing forward, aching to be released. She thought of every time she had sung alone in her bedroom, her voice echoing off cracked walls. She thought of church Sundays, where her voice joined with others to reach the heavens. She thought of nights when she had sung herself to sleep, her only comfort against the chaos around her. This stage was different, yes, but her voice was the same. And tonight, it was all she had. The laughter had quieted now, but the condescension still lingered in the air. The room still doubted her, still expected her to stumble. But Amara's fire had caught, and it would not be extinguished. She tightened her grip on the microphone. This was not the moment she had to survive. This was the moment she had to claim. She breathed in once more, steady and deliberate, and felt the shift inside her solidify. Her fear had become fuel. The mockery had become momentum. The stage had become a battlefield, and her voice would be her sword. The audience didn't know it yet, but their laughter had already lost its power. Because Amara Johnson was about to sing. And when she did, nothing in that auditorium would ever be the same again. The spotlight was merciless. It poured down on Amara in a blinding white glare, so hot she could feel a bead of sweat trickle down the back of her neck. Beyond it, the auditorium stretched into shadow. Rows of faces blurred together, but she didn't need to see them clearly to know what they were thinking. She could hear it in the shifting seats, the impatient sighs, the whispers that buzzed like gnats in the dark. She doesn't belong here. This one's going to be bad. Why did she even sign up? Their doubt was suffocating, filling the space around her like smoke. Her throat felt dry, her hands damp. She curled her fingers tighter around the microphone stand, as though it might anchor her to the earth. Her knees trembled beneath her long skirt, a tremor she prayed the audience couldn't see. She had imagined this moment so many times, standing on stage, opening her mouth, letting her voice fill the air, but reality was harsher, heavier, lonelier. The host had disappeared into the wings, leaving her exposed and small. The judges shifted in their seats, their faces pools of shadow lit by faint stage lights. One leaned on his elbow, his mouth curled into something between boredom and disdain. Another tapped her pen against her clipboard, already writing notes before Amara had even sung. The weight of judgment pressed against her chest. She had spent her whole life feeling that weight. Amara had grown up in a neighborhood where dreams were often smaller than they should be. The cracked sidewalks and faded paint of her apartment building had never been the kind of place where people expected brilliance to bloom. Her mother worked double shifts at the diner, her father gone since Amara was 8. Money was always tight, opportunities always scarce. Her one refuge had been her grandmother's living room. The tiny house smelled of lavender soap and old wood, and the radio was always tuned to gospel or jazz. Her grandmother, Mama Jo, had a voice that could lift walls, rich and booming, filling the small space with warmth. "Sing, "Baby," Mama Joe used to say, patting the spot beside her on the couch. "Don't be shy. Don't you ever be shy with what God gave you." And Amara would sing, soft at first, then louder as her grandmother's hands clapped in rhythm. It was the only place she never felt judged. The only place she believed she was more than what the world saw. But Mama Joe was gone now, buried on a rainy April morning when Amara was just 14. Since then, every note she sang carried a trace of loss, a shadow of the woman who had once told her she was destined for more. It was Mama Joe's voice she heard even now, steady in her memory. "When your time comes, fill the room." The trouble was, what if this wasn't her time? What if the audience was right? Amara's stomach knotted as her eyes flicked across the crowd. A boy in the front row whispered something to his friend, and both snickered. A woman yawned openly, hand covering her mouth. The judge's pen scratched on, as if her failure was already a foregone conclusion. Her confidence wavered. Her mind betrayed her with flashes of every failure she'd carried. The time in elementary school when she had tried to join the choir and the director had said, "We're looking for stronger voices." The time in middle school when classmates had mimicked her braids and called her "church mouse" for singing hymns under her breath. The time she sang alone in her bedroom, pressing a pillow over her face so the neighbors wouldn't hear. She felt them all now, piling on her shoulders. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, her breath shallow. Her voice, her gift, her refuge, suddenly seemed far away, trapped behind the wall of fear closing in. What if they laugh? What if I crack? What if I prove them right? The thought was unbearable. Her gaze fell to the stage floor, scuffed from years of hopeful shoes just like hers. For a moment, she imagined walking off, slipping into the shadows, disappearing before the humiliation could root itself in her bones. The door backstage was so close. Escape was easy. But then another memory pushed through, the day she found the flyer for this very talent show. It had been tacked to the bulletin board at the library, "Local Talent Showcase, all are welcome." The words had pulled her in, tugging at something deep in her chest. She had stood there for minutes, reading it again and again, until she could imagine her grandmother's hand on her shoulder, urging her forward. All are welcome. She had signed up because of those words. She had signed up because for once, she wanted to be seen. Not pitted, not mocked, seen. If she walked off now, she would be letting them write her story for her. And Amara had promised herself she wouldn't live like that anymore. Her hands still shook, but she loosened her grip on the microphone. Her shoulders lifted as she inhaled deeply, pulling air into lungs that had once carried hours of songs in the safety of her grandmother's home. The whispers in the crowd faded for just a moment as she found stillness. This was doubt, yes, but it was also her proving ground. And somewhere in the doubt's shadows, the spark of courage stirred. She lifted her eyes from the stage floor to the sea of faces waiting, mocking, expecting her collapse. The spotlight still burned hot, but she no longer felt like it was her enemy. It was. Her heart pounded louder, her breath steadied, and as the auditorium leaned in, waiting for the failure they expected, she knew something they didn't. She wasn't here to meet their expectations. She was here to break them. And with that thought burning like fire inside her, she prepared to sing. The auditorium seemed to hold its breath. Amara stood frozen in the spotlight, the microphone trembling in her hand. For what felt like forever, she hadn't made a sound. Just silence, thick, suffocating, expectant silence. It was the kind of silence that mocked her, as though daring her to crack under its weight. A cough echoed from the back row. Somewhere in the middle, a girl giggled, quickly muffled by her friend's hand. One of the judges checked his watch, already tired of the suspense. But Amara didn't rush. She couldn't. Her chest rose and fell slowly, deliberately, as she tried to ground herself. She thought about walking away again, about giving in to the doubt pressing down on her shoulders. But the thought made her stomach turn. No. Not now. Not when she had already stood this long in front of them. She inhaled, deep and steady. And then, she sang. It began softly, almost like a whisper, but it was a note so pure, so achingly clear, that the auditorium seemed to snap into focus around it. The sound rose into the air, trembling at first, but crystalline, like the first drop of rain after a drought. Every rustle, every murmur, every smirk froze. The girl who had giggled dropped her hand from her mouth, eyes widening. The judge who had been writing paused mid-scribble, his pen hovering above the page. Even the host, leaning casually against the wall backstage, straightened up, his grin faltering. Amara's voice floated outward, delicate yet undeniable. She gripped the microphone tighter, drawing strength from the vibration in her throat. Her body still trembled, but her voice was free. It carried years of secrets, years of unspoken longing, years of practicing in silence where no one could laugh. The first note lingered in the air longer than it should have, as though refusing to leave. And when it finally dissolved into the silence, it left behind a hush so heavy that the entire room felt transformed. No one laughed now. Amara almost didn't believe it herself. The sound had come from her, but it didn't feel like hers alone. It was her grandmother's hand on her back, steadying her. It was the cracked walls of her bedroom, echoing her private songs. It was every moment of dismissal and every wound she had carried, reshaped into something beautiful. Her second note followed, stronger, steadier. And with it came a shift inside her, a quiet defiance, a realization that she was no longer performing just to survive the moment. She was reclaiming it. The fear didn't vanish, but it bowed to something greater. She closed her eyes, allowing the sound to swell, to carry her away from the suffocating doubt. Her voice rose, each note unfolding like a secret she had kept locked inside for far too long. The audience leaned in. They had been ready to laugh, ready to dismiss her, ready to confirm the story they had written before she even opened her mouth. But now they sat still, stunned into silence, eyes wide, mouth slightly parted. One man in the third row blinked hard, as though trying to decide if what he heard was real. A group of teenagers who had been whispering moments ago now sat motionless, their mocking grins erased. Even the judges had changed. The smirking man in the sharp suit no longer looked amused, his brows furrowed as he leaned forward, elbows pressing into the table. The woman who had covered her laugh earlier now stared openly, her pen forgotten on the desk. And the third judge, who hadn't looked up once during the first acts, was watching intently, lips parted in astonishment. Amara didn't notice them. Not fully. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly back, her whole body surrendering to the music pouring from her chest. She no longer sang to prove them wrong. She sang because she could not sing. She sang because it was the truest part of herself, and for the first time, she had decided not to hide it. Her voice swelled, rising higher now, lifting into the rafters of the auditorium. The sound vibrated against the walls, seeped into the floorboards, climbed into the very air until it felt as though the entire building pulsed with her song. It was not perfect. A slight quiver lingered at the edge of some notes. But that quiver carried something raw and real, pain, longing, resilience, that perfection could never hold. It was human. And it was devastatingly beautiful. Somewhere in the back, a woman's eyes filled with tears. She didn't know this girl, didn't know her struggles, but the sound pierced through her like truth. A young boy beside her sat up straighter, his earlier boredom forgotten. The host, still half hidden in the wings, shook his head slowly in disbelief. He had introduced her with a smirk, expecting a joke. Now, he couldn't look away. The judges were no longer writing. No longer whispering. They were staring, transfixed, as though the plain, nervous girl who had stepped onto the stage had been replaced by something luminous, something untouchable. Amara reached for the end of the verse, her voice finding a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She could feel the air vibrating in her lungs, her chest, her very bones. She could feel the song becoming larger than her body, larger than her fear. And as the final note of the phrase spilled into the silence, she opened her eyes. What she saw stole her breath more than the singing ever could. Everywhere she looked, the audience was frozen, no laughter, no whispers, no smirks. Just stillness, reverence, awe. For the first time in her life, hundreds of eyes were fixed on her, and none of them looked down on her. None of them mocked her. They listened. Amara's lips trembled as she drew in another breath. She realized, with a jolt of power, that the first note had been enough to shift the entire room. But she wasn't finished. Not yet. The silence that followed wasn't cruel anymore. It wasn't waiting for her to fail. It was holding space for her, waiting for what she would give next. And in that silence, Amara understood something that made her heart swell until it nearly burst. This was her stage now. Her time. Her voice. The mockery had ended with that first note. What came next would change everything. The final note of Amara's opening phrase hung in the air, shimmering, before dissolving into stillness. And then, nothing. The auditorium was so quiet that she could hear the faint buzz of the stage lights above her head, the low hum of the sound system, even the rustle of fabric as someone in the front row crossed their legs. But there were no coughs, no laughter, no whispers. Only silence. For Amara, silence had always been an enemy. It was the silence of classrooms where no one called on her. The silence of crowded hallways where her presence went unnoticed. The silence of dinners where her words seemed too small to fill the space. Silence had always meant invisibility. But this silence was different. This silence was heavy. It pressed down on the room not with dismissal, but with awe. Amara's breath caught. Her pulse pounded so loudly she was certain the microphone would pick it up. She opened her eyes and scanned the crowd, bracing herself for the sneers, for the rolling eyes, for the smirks that had greeted her just moments ago. But what she saw nearly buckled her knees. The boy in the front row who had laughed earlier now sat wide-eyed, his lips parted, as though he'd forgotten how to breathe. A group of teenagers halfway back leaned forward in their seats, their expressions stripped of mockery, replaced by something like wonder. Even the woman who had yawned had lowered her hand, her eyes locked on Amara as though afraid to blink. The silence was stunned silence. Reverent silence. It was hers. On stage, Amara's grip loosened on the microphone. For the first time since stepping into the spotlight, her body stopped trembling. She felt a calm wash over her, not the absence of fear but the presence of something greater, ownership. This stage was no longer hostile ground. It was hers. Her voice had carved out space where she belonged, and now the silence was proof. She glanced at the judges. The man in the sharp suit, who had leaned back with a smirk before she sang, now leaned forward, elbows on the table, his chin resting on his knuckles. His eyes, narrowed earlier in mock amusement, were now wide with focus. The woman beside him had dropped her pen entirely, fingers laced together as she stared intently. And the third judge, who hadn't looked up all evening, now sat bolt upright, his clipboard forgotten, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and admiration. They looked less like judges now and more like witnesses. And Amara had given them something worth witnessing. A small flicker of memory returned to her then, her grandmother, Mama Joe, leaning forward on their worn living room couch, clapping along to her singing. "Don't stop, baby," she had said. "Once you've got their ears, don't you ever let go." Amara could almost feel her grandmother's hand against her back now, warm and steady, urging her to continue. The silence, though reverent, stretched taut. It begged to be broken. She inhaled again. This time, the breath didn't tremble. Her voice rose once more, stronger than before, fuller, bolder. It poured into the auditorium, filling every corner, reaching every ear, refusing to be ignored. The silence shattered, not into laughter or chatter, but into the sound of her song. And still, the audience remained hushed, captivated. Her voice moved like a river now, sometimes gentle and flowing, sometimes crashing with power. Each note carried more than sound, it carried a story, a piece of her soul she had never dared to show the world. The pain of being overlooked, the resilience forged in loneliness, the quiet hope that had lived inside her even when no one else believed, it was all there, woven into the fabric of her song. Her voice quivered only once, and instead of weakness, it sounded raw, human, achingly real. It was not the voice of someone trying to impress. It was the voice of someone revealing herself. And the room drank it in, silently, hungrily. In the third row, an older woman pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes glistening. She didn't know this girl on stage, but something about the song unlocked memories she had long buried, memories of her own silenced dreams. A man beside her nodded slowly, as though agreeing with words unspoken. Even the restless children in the back stopped fidgeting. The silence that had once felt like a noose now felt like a crown. Amara wore it proudly. Midway through her song, she dared to open her eyes again. What she saw was transformation. Not just in the audience, but in herself. The girl who had walked onto the stage moments ago, shy and trembling, seemed like a stranger now. Her voice had pulled something fierce from deep inside her, something unbreakable. And as she sang, she realized she wasn't just proving herself to the audience. She was proving herself to herself. For too long, she had believed the lies whispered about her, that she was small, forgettable, unremarkable. For too long, she had hidden her light, afraid of laughter, afraid of rejection. But now, as her voice soared into the rafters, she felt those lies shatter, piece by piece, like glass under her feet. She wasn't small. She wasn't forgettable. She wasn't unremarkable. She was a force. And the stunned silence of the room was her evidence. As the final chorus swelled, Amara gave everything she had. Her lungs burned, her chest ached, but she didn't hold back. She pushed the note higher, longer, brighter, until it filled the space with something undeniable. When at last the final note broke and dissolved into the air, the silence returned. But now, it was holy. The audience didn't rush to clap. Didn't rush to cheer. They sat suspended in the aftermath, as though afraid that even their applause might break the spell too soon. The silence wrapped around them like reverence, like prayer. And in that silence, Amara stood taller than she ever had in her life. For a heartbeat, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The crowd stared at her. The judges stared at her. Even she stared inwardly at herself, astonished at what she had just unleashed. The silence was no longer her enemy. It was her victory. And in that victory, Amara realized something that made her throat tighten with emotion. She had always believed she needed their approval, their applause, their validation to matter. But in this silence, in this stunned, reverent, breathless silence, she understood the truth. Her voice was enough. Her voice had always been enough. And tonight, the world finally knew it too. For a suspended moment, the silence was sacred. The audience sat frozen, still reeling from the first notes, still trying to reconcile the shy, plain girl who had stepped nervously on stage with the power that had just filled the room. Their disbelief held them captive. No one dared to breathe too loudly, afraid of breaking the fragile spell she had cast. But Amara was not done. Not yet. She drew in another breath, deeper this time, surer. Her chest expanded as though it could hold the world, and when she released it, her voice surged forth with a force that startled even her. It was no longer tentative, no longer soft. It was rising. The next verse carried heat, urgency, a rawness that gripped the heart. Her voice rippled through the auditorium like a wave, building strength, building momentum, sweeping everything in its path. The walls seemed to hum with her sound, the floorboards to vibrate beneath the weight of it. The girl who had once hesitated to be heard now sang as though she had been waiting her entire life for this very stage, this very moment. Each note climbed higher, steadier, bolder, until the song became larger than her body, larger than the stage, larger than the doubt that had clung to her like a shadow. The silence of the audience shifted. It was no longer stunned, it was enraptured. Heads tilted upward. Eyes widened. Lips parted. The power of her voice pulled them all forward, as though gravity itself had changed direction. In the third row, the older woman who had clutched her chest earlier now whispered something to the man beside her. "Do you hear that?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was tight, his hands gripping his knees as though to steady himself against the swell of sound. Farther back, a group of restless teenagers who had been on the verge of leaving now sat bolt upright, their mockery forgotten. One of them, unable to help himself, let out a low, "Damn," earning a sharp elbow from his friend, but the awe in his eyes didn't fade. Even the judges had transformed. The man in the sharp suit no longer lounged in his chair. He leaned forward, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming unconsciously against the table as though trying to keep up with the rhythm of her song. The woman judge's pen lay forgotten on the floor, her eyes wide, her lips moving silently as though trying to follow along. And the third judge, once so detached, now mouthed a single word under his breath: "Extraordinary." Amara felt it too. She could sense the energy shifting around her, swelling with every note she gave. It fed her, lifted her higher. For years, she had sung in secret, pouring her voice into empty rooms, filling only her own ears. But now it was reaching hearts she had never touched before. Her voice wasn't just sound. It was power. It was confession. It was liberation. And it was unstoppable. Her song climbed toward its chorus, and with each line, her voice seemed to break through invisible walls. She remembered the faces of classmates who had laughed at her. She remembered teachers who had passed over her hand, neighbors who had called her sweet, but never special. Every note was defiance. Every run was rebellion. Every breath was a declaration: "You were wrong about me." The song rose higher, fiercer, until her body ached with the effort. Sweat glistened on her brow, her hands gripping the microphone not in fear now but in command. Her voice cut through the air like lightning, filling every inch of space. And the audience, once doubtful, once cruel, began to stir. It started small. A murmur of admiration here, a nod of the head there. Then someone clapped softly on an off-beat, too moved to wait until the end. The sound was quickly hushed, but it didn't matter, Amara had felt it. The energy in the room was shifting from silence to something electric. The teenagers in the back exchanged glances, then leaned forward, clapping in rhythm with her rise. A woman near the aisle tapped her foot, tears streaking her cheeks, unable to contain the emotion welling inside her. And as Amara hit a note so high, so pure, it seemed to pierce the ceiling, the room erupted. The audience couldn't contain themselves anymore. Cheers broke out. Shouts of encouragement, "Sing it, girl." "Yes," rose above the music. People clapped, some stood, their earlier skepticism burned away by the fire of her voice. What had begun as mockery was now reverence. What had begun as silence was now thunder. But through it all, Amara didn't falter. She didn't shrink. She rose. Her voice soared above the clapping, above the cheers, unshaken and unbent. She rode the energy like a wave, letting it carry her higher than she had ever dared to go. Her lungs burned, her throat strained, but she pushed on, pouring every ounce of herself into the music. It wasn't just performance anymore, it was testimony. It was her life, her struggle, her grief, her resilience, distilled into sound. And the audience felt it. Every single person in that auditorium felt it. By the time she reached the final chorus, the room was unrecognizable. The same people who had smirked when her name was called were now on their feet, clapping and cheering. The judges who had dismissed her now leaned so close to the stage it was as if they couldn't bear to miss a single note. And Amara, once trembling, once doubting, stood taller than she had ever stood in her life. Her song had risen, unstoppable, and taken the room with it. The last note burst from her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, radiant and fierce. She held it longer than she thought possible, her chest heaving, her soul straining, until at last she released it into the air and let it fade. When it ended, the silence returned. But this silence was not empty. It was the breath before the roar. And when the roar came, when the audience exploded into applause so thunderous the walls shook, Amara realized that something inside her had changed forever. Her voice was no longer hidden. Her voice was no longer small. Her voice had risen, unstoppable. And nothing, not doubt, not mockery, not silence, could ever bury it again. The applause thundered through the auditorium, shaking the rafters, bouncing off the walls like rolling waves. Amara stood at the center of it all, clutching the microphone, her chest heaving as though she had run a marathon. The roar of approval crashed over her again and again, but she didn't shrink from it. For the first time in her life, she welcomed it. She had sung, and the world had listened. But more than that, something had broken inside her. Something that had shackled her for years. And now, in the echo of her final note, she could feel the chains lying in pieces around her feet. The sound of the crowd blurred into a pulse in her ears, each clap like a heartbeat reminding her she was alive, that she was seen. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sensation wash over her. And as she did, her mind unspooled memories that had been locked away for too long. She was 6 years old again, standing in the schoolyard, singing softly to herself while other children skipped rope. A teacher had walked by, frowned, and said, "You're a bit loud, dear. Save it for later." The other children had giggled. She had swallowed her song that day. She was 12, humming at the back of class when a boy sneered, "Why do you sing like that? No one wants to hear you." The laughter of her classmates had burned hotter than fire. She had fallen silent for months afterward. She was 15, auditioning for the school choir. The director, a stern woman with sharp glasses, had pursed her lips and said, "Your voice is unusual. Maybe try something else." And then she had been alone in her room, again and again, whispering her songs into the darkness because the world had told her she wasn't meant to be heard. But tonight those voices no longer mattered. Tonight her voice had filled the auditorium, poured through every ear, touched every soul. She could feel it in the tears of the woman near the aisle, in the odd stares of the restless teenagers, in the stunned faces of the judges who had once looked at her with pity. It wasn't just a song. It was reclamation. Every note she had sung had broken another link in the chain that bound her. Every high run had shattered another wall of doubt. With each breath, she had smashed the bars of a prison built from other people's underestimation. And as she stood there, her body trembling not with fear but with release, she realized she had freed herself. The audience's applause began to take shape, rhythmic, unified. They clapped in time, stamping their feet, chanting her name. Amara. 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 The sound of it struck her chest harder than any insult ever had. She blinked rapidly, tears slipping down her cheeks. For so long, she had been invisible. And now, this storm of voices calling her name as though she were already a legend. The host, who had once mocked her introduction, now stood at the edge of the stage, his mouth hanging open. He raised the microphone to speak, but the audience's chanting drowned him out. For once, he was irrelevant. The power no longer belonged to him, or the judges, or anyone else. It belonged to her. And in that moment, something shifted inside Amara. She understood that this was bigger than one performance. Bigger than one night. Bigger than one song. This was about every time someone had looked at her and seen only a shadow of what she was. This was about every girl told she was too plain, too quiet, too different to matter. This was about breaking chains not only for herself, but for others who needed to know that silence was not their destiny. She wasn't just singing anymore. She was fighting. The roar of the crowd faded in her ears as another voice emerged in her memory, her grandmother's. "When your time comes, child, don't hold back. Fill the room. Break their walls. Make them hear you." Her grandmother had believed in her before anyone else. She had been gone for years now, but Amara felt her presence tonight, standing at the edge of the stage, smiling, nodding as if to say, "See? I told you." Amara pressed her free hand against her chest. The weight of her grandmother's faith, the memory of every silenced moment, and the triumph of tonight wove together into something unshakable. The chains were gone. She was free. The audience began to settle, though the energy in the room still crackled like lightning. The host finally stepped forward, his voice trembling as he tried to regain control. "Ladies and gentlemen," he cleared his throat, his usual bravado absent. That was Amara. The crowd cheered louder at her name. He swallowed, his eyes darting toward the judges' table. The judges, too, were forever changed. The man in the sharp suit rubbed a hand across his face as though trying to compose himself. The woman judge shook her head slowly, her lips parted in disbelief. The third judge leaned back, his arms crossed, but his eyes gleamed, betraying the awe he could no longer hide. They had underestimated her. They had laughed inside, written her off before she even opened her mouth. And now they knew. Now they would never forget. Amara looked out over the sea of faces, her heart pounding. She had walked on stage as a girl mocked into silence. She stood there now as a woman who had shattered that silence. Her voice had not only silenced the judges, it had broken the chains of doubt that bound her. And in their place, something new had risen. Strength. Confidence. Freedom. As the crowd began to rise to its feet again, Amara realized this was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. Her voice, once hidden, once hushed, was free now. And it would carry her farther than she had ever dared to dream. The chains were broken. And the girl who was once a joke was now unstoppable. The thunder of applause rolled on, crashing against the walls of the auditorium, echoing like waves against a cliffside. Amara stood in the middle of it all, still trembling from the force of her own song, still clutching the microphone as though it were her anchor in the storm she had just unleashed. The ovation felt endless, and for a moment, she thought she might dissolve inside of it, just disappear into the roar of voices chanting her name. She had sung her truth, and now it was echoing back at her, multiplied 1,000-fold. But then the host, still fumbling for composure, stepped forward. His voice cracked through the sound system, though even the microphone seemed too small for the weight of the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his usual cocky tone stripped away, that was Amara. The audience answered with another eruption of cheers. The host glanced sideways at her, his grin shaky, forced, an echo of the arrogance he had displayed when first mocking her introduction. But now, behind his mask, his eyes betrayed something else entirely, regret, maybe shame, and above all, awe. Amara felt no bitterness toward him. She didn't need to. Her song had already spoken louder than anything he could say. The host turned toward the judges, his words faltering. "Well, let's hear what the judges have to say." The energy in the room shifted again, this time into an expectant hush. All eyes moved to the panel. The man in the sharp suit leaned forward, elbows planted firmly on the desk, his expression unreadable. A vein pulsed at his temple. He had been the most dismissive of them all earlier, smirking at her as if she were no more than an inconvenience. Now, that smirk was gone, replaced by something heavier. The woman judge sat rigid, her pen still lying forgotten on the floor. Her lips parted slightly as though she were still searching for air, her hands pressed together as if in silent prayer. And the third judge, stoic, detached, skeptical, hadn't moved since the last note faded. He sat back with arms crossed, eyes fixed on Amara, his jaw tight as if holding something back. The man in the suit cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. He paused, swallowed, and tried again. "I'll be honest. When you walked out here, I didn't expect much." The audience murmured. Some hissed at his candor, others chuckled knowingly. But the man lifted a hand, silencing them. "And I was wrong." The words landed with the weight of confession. "What you just did," he continued, leaning closer, "was not a performance, it was a revelation. You didn't just sing, Amara. You commanded this stage. You held all of us in your hands, and you didn't let go until you were finished. That's greatness." The crowd roared again, stamping their feet. Amara lowered her gaze, her cheeks flushing, her heart swelling. The woman judge took her turn, shaking her head slowly as if still struggling to believe what she had witnessed. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "Amara, I want you to know something. When you walked on stage, I saw a nervous young woman. I thought the crowd was laughing at you because they knew what was coming. I thought we'd all be watching another forgettable moment. She exhaled, her eyes shimmering. But then you opened your mouth, and time stopped. I felt every note in my chest, like you were singing my own story back to me. You took this room, with all its doubt, all its cruelty, and you transformed it into a sanctuary. That's not just talent. That's soul. And soul can't be taught, it only comes from someone who's lived, who's felt, who's carried weight most people can't imagine. Tears slipped down Amara's cheeks at those words. The woman judge's sincerity pierced her like sunlight breaking through clouds. The audience erupted once more, whistling, clapping, cheering. Then came the third judge. He remained still for a long moment, letting the noise die down until only silence lingered. His face was stone, but his eyes gave him away. Finally, he leaned into the microphone. You want to know what I think? His voice was calm, measured, but it carried a weight that commanded attention. I think we just witnessed the birth of a star. The audience gasped, then cheered louder than ever. The judge raised a hand, steadying the room. There are singers who have voices, and then there are artists who have power. Amara, you have both. The way you held that final note, he shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips for the first time. That was not the work of a beginner. That was the mark of someone destined for greatness. The words hung in the air like a crown being placed upon her head. Amara's knees trembled, and for a second, she thought she might collapse beneath the weight of it all. She had walked onto this stage as the butt of a joke. She stood now, transformed, as someone no one could laugh at ever again. The audience rose to its feet, chanting her name again, stomping, clapping, creating a rhythm that shook the floor beneath her. The sound was overwhelming, deafening, but she no longer feared it. She basked in it. Because this wasn't just applause. This was respect. Amara lifted the microphone once more, her voice trembling with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. It was all she could manage. The crowd answered with another roar, as though her two words were a song in themselves. She didn't need to say more. Her voice had already said everything. In the front row, a little black girl stood on her chair, her small hands cupped around her mouth as she shouted, "That's me. That's me one day." Amara's heart cracked open at the sight. Her victory wasn't hers alone, it was theirs, too. Every child who had ever been silenced. Every dreamer who had ever been mocked. Every soul who had been told, "You're not enough." Her triumph was proof, they were wrong. And in that moment, Amara understood that she had earned something far greater than applause, far greater than compliments from judges. She had earned her place. Her respect. Her voice would no longer be ignored. As the lights dimmed and the host tried to close the segment, the audience refused to quiet. They kept clapping, kept cheering, kept chanting her name. It was as though they were determined to etch her presence into the walls of the auditorium forever. Amara stood tall, tears glistening on her cheeks, her chest rising and falling with the weight of everything she had carried and everything she had broken free from. She had silenced the laughter. She had shattered the doubt. And now, she stood bathed in the thunder of respect, earned, undeniable, unstoppable. The auditorium lights dimmed, but the echoes of applause lingered, pulsing through the air like an aftershock. Even as the host tried to usher the program forward, the audience resisted, unwilling to let go of what they had just witnessed. Amara stood at center stage, tears drying on her cheeks, her heart still racing from the performance that had changed everything. The microphone was heavy in her hand, but she no longer clutched it for comfort. Now, it felt like a torch she had been chosen to carry. The noise around her began to soften into something gentler, warm applause, whistles, the occasional chant of her name, like waves receding into the sea. And as it did, Amara realized that the night was not ending. It was beginning. Backstage, the chaos buzzed louder than the audience's roar. Crew members whispered excitedly to each other, their eyes darting toward Amara as she stepped into the wings. Someone handed her a bottle of water, another brushed her shoulder in silent congratulations. But Amara barely registered them. Her body felt weightless, her mind floating somewhere between disbelief and euphoria. She found a chair in the corner, lowering herself slowly as if she were afraid the spell might shatter if she moved too quickly. She pressed the cool water bottle against her forehead, closing her eyes. The memories came rushing back again, every insult, every dismissal, every time someone had looked at her and seen less than what she was. They rose up, sharp and painful, but this time they did not sting. This time they dissolved in the glow of triumph, like shadows retreating before the dawn. Her grandmother's voice filled her heart again, "When your time comes, child, don't hold back. Fill the room." She had done it. She had filled not just the room, but the hearts of everyone inside it. Amara opened her eyes and stared at her trembling hands. They were the same hands that had once hidden her face, the same hands that had clenched into fists when she was mocked. But tonight, they had held the microphone steady. Tonight, they had opened the door to a future she had only dared to imagine. The curtain shifted, and one of the stagehands whispered, "They're still talking about you out there. The judges can't stop." Amara blinked. The judges. For so long, authority figures had been the ones to diminish her, to measure her and find her lacking. And now those same figures had called her extraordinary, had crowned her with words like star and destined for greatness. She thought of the sharp-suited man, stripped of arrogance, forced into humility. She thought of the woman judge, her sincerity spilling like tears. And she thought of the stoic one, his guarded facade cracking just enough to let admiration through. They had all been wrong. And she had proved it. Her chest swelled with something fierce, something she had never quite felt before. Not just relief. Not just pride. Freedom. Her voice had freed her from the prison of silence. But more than that, it had freed her from the need for their approval. She didn't sing tonight to prove them wrong. She sang because she was ready to prove herself right. That, she realized, was the real beginning. The little girl in the front row flashed across her memory again, the one who had stood on her chair, shouting, "That's me. That's me one day." Amara's breath caught in her throat. That was the true gift of the night. Not the applause, not the compliments, not even the judge's awe. It was the spark she had lit in someone else's heart. She had shown that little girl, and maybe countless others watching, that their voices mattered. That no amount of laughter or doubt could bury them if they chose to rise. Amara had become the proof she had once longed for herself. A stagehand tapped her shoulder. "You'll need to come back for the final bow." Amara stood, her legs steadier now. She walked back toward the curtain, her steps no longer timid but deliberate, filled with purpose. As she emerged once more into the light, the audience erupted again. This time, she didn't flinch. She lifted her chin, let her tears shine proudly, and raised her hand in gratitude. The roar of their response rolled over her, but it didn't overwhelm her. It crowned her. When the curtain fell for the last time, Amara walked out into the night air. The cool breeze brushed her face, carrying away the heat of the lights and the weight of expectation. She inhaled deeply, her lungs filling with freedom, with possibility. The city stretched out before her, lights twinkling like 1,000 waiting stages. Each one a chance. Each one a new beginning. She smiled to herself, clutching her bag tighter. She was no longer the girl mocked into silence. She was no longer the timid shadow at the back of the room. She was a voice. A voice that had risen, unstoppable. And the world would hear it again. As she walked down the quiet street toward home, Amara whispered softly to herself, not out of fear, not out of longing, but out of certainty. This is just the start. Her words vanished into the night, carried by the wind, but the truth of them burned bright inside her. The chains were gone. The respect was hers. And the girl who had once been called on stage as a joke had found her beginning, not at the end of her song, but at the very moment she realized her voice would never be silenced again. Amara smiled into the darkness, the echoes of the crowd still alive in her ears. A new chapter had opened. A new voice had risen. And a new star had been born. Her story had only just begun.